The other day I was watching the Joe Rogan podcast. I normally don't watch him anymore, but he had my favorite all-time comedian on there, Dave Attell, so I watched. They started talking about the problem squatters are becoming these days in the United States. This sort of thing's been going on for a very long time, but in the last handful of years, it's gotten worse. They even have people online showing you how you could become a squatter and how you could actually take over someone's property if you're there long enough. Squatters have more rights than the people that actually own the land, and there's a reason for this. Horrible landlords. Over the years, landlords have done all kinds of crappy things, so laws have been put in place. Downside of those laws, people exploit the laws and basically become squatters and live in people's property for anywhere from a month, 6 months, a couple of years, or more. They use these laws that are called squatter rights, also known as adverse possession. And these laws exist in all 50 states across the US. And how and when these laws are enforced differ from state to state. For 20 states, if a squatter has been squatting for a certain length of time, they can basically file some paperwork and steal your house out from underneath you. Now, this time varies from 7 years to 30 years. Today we're listing all those states and the amount of time it takes someone to plant their flag and snatch your land right out from underneath you. Got it? Get it? Good. Let's take a look. Number 20, New Jersey. New Jersey, they do have the laws where someone can actually claim your property, but they make it almost impossible. They got a pretty serious waiting list. You have to maintain that property, be living on that property. Nobody shows up for 30 years. After 30 years, you could file the paperwork and that piece of property becomes your property. Now, 30 years seems like a very long time and it'll never happen. Well, it can happen. Sometimes people buy property or they're left property and they never go check on it. And they just kind of have it there as maybe in case they want to do something with it later. My grandmother was one of these people. She had some property in Clear Lake, California. She had never been up there. My grandfather bought it. It's like 40 years later, she decided she wanted to sell it. She was, getting older. The city had been using it as a parking lot for almost 30 years. The moral of the story is keep your eye on your property. There's another rule in New Jersey when it comes to just property, when there's land, no house. If you've done some sort of beautification to it, you can avoid trespasser prosecution. Now, here are the 3 requirements you have to meet to take over some land in New Jersey. You have to occupy the non-woodland property for 30 continuous years, have color of title at least as long, and you have to pay the property taxes for at least 5 consecutive years of occupation. But really, it's 30 years and the property is yours. Today's video is sponsored by Factor. Factor makes meeting your nutritional goals easier than ever before by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your doorstep. They got some really good meals. I like the chili chicken. That one's pretty good. They also have a fajita one that is delicious. I also like these wellness shots, which I think I'm having too many of these. They're pretty good. Personally, I love the fact that there's no prep, no mess. Factor's meals are 100% ready to heat and eat, so there's no prepping, no ingredients you have to add to it, no cleanup needed. You also have a flexible schedule. Get as much or as little as you need by choosing 6 to 18 meals per week. Plus, you could pause or reschedule your deliveries anytime. They have a lot to choose from. Keto, smart calorie, vegan, veggie. There's over 35 different options a week to choose from. Head on over to Factor75.com or click on the link below and use the code BRIGGS50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and free wellness shots for life. 2 free wellness shots from 3 available flavors for every order while you're an active subscriber. Number 19, Ohio. Ohio is not as long as New Jersey, but they have a lot of the same requirements. Now, this happened many times in the farmlands around Ohio, and in recent years, a lot of places in Cleveland and Toledo have become other people's property because it was kind of run down and nobody checked on it since like the 80s. So here's how the rule reads. You have to possess the property for 21 years in Ohio to be able to claim it as your own. And here's how it reads. Any entry and possession of the required 21 years that is exclusive, continuous, hostile, actual, and open, even if the person mistakenly thought they had the title, is sufficient to support the claim of the title in adverse possession. In other words, if you took it over, You've been there 21 years, even by mistake. Let's say you thought some of the acreage next to yours was yours and you were, let's say, farming it or whatever. If you've been there 21 years and nobody's complained or brought it up to you, you could file to have that property as your own. But in the end, Ohio, it requires 21 years to take over the land. Illinois. This is another one that's big in Chicago. A lot of abandoned property is being taken over in the south side of Chicago. I shouldn't say a lot are in the middle of doing this because there's a lot of abandoned property in the really bad parts of Chicago. This is one of the places where a lot of people have been teaching each other how to take over property. There's also people that are teaching homeowners the importance of regular checkups on their properties. Now, whenever you have someone teaching people how to do something, it's going to become a plague, for lack of a better word. More and more people will try and do this, it'll become a problem, and laws will change and they won't be able to do it anymore. But the rule in Illinois, no matter the reason, a squatter ended up on a property, Illinois law states that they may be able to gain title and ownership of the property after residing there for 20 years. So that's one thing you have to do. You have to live there or you have to be working the land. You don't just go there, put a claim on it, and then wait 20 years and it's yours. You have to actually be there. So it's not like you could try and do this with 20 different pieces of property. So yeah, Illinois, 20 years, it's your land. Georgia. This one sort of surprises me. People of Georgia tend to know their land. And if they're the rural people, they know exactly where their piece of property ends and their neighbor's starts. That's kind of a thing throughout the South. Everyone knows their property. But I guess it happens enough to where it's a problem with squatters these days. Maybe not as much in the rural areas of Georgia, but definitely in some of the more rundown cities. Now, most states don't have predictions of how many people are squatting currently. But I did find one stat that said there's over 1,200 current squatter homes in the metro Atlanta area. And as of February 2024, there are now 3 bills going through the General Assembly to change the laws on squatting. I think we're going to see more of this in the coming years. Like I said, once people start teaching you how to do it, laws are going to change. So half the people that get the idea of doing this, they'll never get to the finish line. Laws will be changed within the next few years. But currently, the laws in Georgia are 20 years. If you maintain this property, add some beautification to it, live there, it becomes yours after 20 years, and you file the proper paperwork. Number 16, North Carolina. There are many different stories about little mountain hideaways. You know, people had cabins up in the mountains of North Carolina or little pieces of land near the coast that they never really went to. Next thing they know, their property is somebody else's. And again, most of the time this has to do with someone was left some property from their parents or grandparents. They finally get around to checking on it. The parents or grandparents hadn't been up there in 15 years. You take 7 years to get up there. You go there, someone's got a house on your property. They should literally call the law, you snooze, you lose. Wait too long to check on that property, and it's gone. North Carolina is another state that has the same reading as Ohio. Actual open, hostile, exclusive, and continuous possession of the land claimed for the prospective period under known and visible lines and boundaries. It's a bunch of legal jargon which says if you go there, plant your flag, it becomes yours after a certain amount of time. And that certain amount of time in North Carolina is also 20 years. Number 15, Massachusetts. Squatting is fairly common in Massachusetts, and squatters can legally gain ownership of private residence if they can show that they have occupied the property continuously, openly, and notoriously for at least 20 years. That's what it says, notoriously. Now, they have 5 other requirements. The hostile thing. This means the squatter does not have a valid lease or rental agreement with the property owner. The open and notorious means the squatter's possession is obvious to anyone, and neighbors are also familiar with them, and they would not know that they were squatting, meaning they've been there so long, nobody knows that they're actually squatting on this property. Exclusive. The squatter does not share possession with others and lives on the property for an uninterrupted period of time. Now, I mean, I'm sure if it's your family, but if it's like 3 different families living on the property, that's gonna, someone's getting kicked out. Color of title. The squatter does not have the legal title or deed to the property. Now, they have one other requirement here also. The squatter does not have a need to have paid property taxes on the land for a certain period of time. Now, Massachusetts does have a little bit different law where they allow certain limitations and requirements for squatters, including compensation for the property to the original owner when the deed is transferred, or relinquishment, as long as the original owner comes forth. Meaning they don't have to proactively go look for the original owner and pay them now that the property's theirs. Massachusetts is also a state that requires 20 years of continuous use. Number 14, Washington State. Yes, you could claim some property in the rainy Pacific Northwest. It will only take you 7 or 18 years. Currently, it's 7 years, but they have some things going on, some lawsuits. Chances are, within the next year, it's going to be 18 years. But there is a possibility that it can be 7 years. Here's some of the things you have to do. Squatters must live on the property for at least 10 years without sharing it with others. Can't be a hostile takeover. This is another situation where the locals have to think that you are the actual owner, meaning you've been there so long, they have no idea you've been squatting. And like so many other states, you have to be paying the property tax. But I honestly think they have a good chance of changing it to 18 years here in the near future in Washington. So we're going to go with that. 18 years and you could have some property. (13) Colorado. Colorado is another place that has a lot of open land on the eastern side, and they have a lot of those mountain towns and, cabins that family may not have checked up on in decades. And when that happens, people move in. There was quite a few things where people, I've talked about this before. There was a big movement when the hippie thing kind of ended in the mid to late 60s, I guess late 60s. A lot of them moved to Colorado. That was the first big rush to Colorado in the 20th century, was the 1960s and 70s. A lot of those hippies found these little chunks of land and cabins up in the mountains that nobody knew about or nobody remembered they had. Colorado has a lot of the same requirements, but it only takes 18 years to snatch up that property. Number 12, Michigan. In Michigan, you could lose your property after a decade and a half. That's it. That's all that's required. And with how long Detroit's been in bad shape and a lot of the other cities, I'm sure there's a lot of old factories that someone is staked a claim to. I don't know if you'd want those properties, but I'm sure someone's tried. In Michigan, if you have property that has not been watched and you haven't checked up on it, 15 years, someone could file the proper paperwork and it could be yours. This has happened to more than a few people that had lakeside property in Michigan. That's a big thing. Everyone has a fishing cabin or something like that, and grandpa dies and everyone forgot about the fishing cabin. Well, someone found it vacant and they moved in. (11) Virginia. Virginia, like Michigan, it only takes a decade and a half and someone's property becomes yours. Virginia, again with the mountains. They have a lot of mountains there and people forget about these places. Grandpa's cabin becomes a squatter's haven. There's more than a couple stories of the owner getting to the property, finding squatters, and taking matters into their own hands. Virginia is a gun-loving state, and if you're going to be a squatter there, I would suggest you be packing too. There's one story of a guy that had been working a vineyard for almost 30 years, and the people found out that they owned this property, and they showed up. Guns were pulled out, but eventually this guy had to go to court, and it was his vineyard now. So he's out in Virginia making wine and packing. It takes 15 years in Virginia to claim somebody else's property. Number 10, Oregon. Oregon, like Virginia and Michigan, it only takes 15 years to gather someone's land. There is a lot of open land in Oregon that nobody's dealt with, especially on the east side of the state. You know, those people that are trying to break off from Oregon and become part of Idaho? Yeah, they got a lot of squatters out that way. Now, Portland has a lot of squatters too, but those are usually in abandoned homes. I actually worked with some girl she was like an advocate for these people. She worked at Netflix with me, and she was an advocate, and she was out protesting squatters being thrown out of houses and stuff like that, doing the human chain around a house so the squatters, the people not paying for the property, could stay. Link arms around a house. I don't know if anyone's ever told you this, but the police can remove your arms when they're linked with each other. I don't know why they always try and do that. They always try and do it on the highway too. By the way, if you want to turn the public against your cause, whatever it is, block their way home when they're coming home from work. Get across that highway. I don't care if your cause is to give YouTubers $2,000 free money every single year from the government. If I have to sit in traffic for 2 hours while the police remove you from the highway, I'm going to be against your cause. But yeah, they do that a lot here in Oregon. They have squatters, especially in the Portland area, that have taken over older homes, and then they, try and remove these people, and they've got advocates. It makes no sense. 15 years in Oregon, and that land becomes yours. Number 9, Nevada. Now, this one I have firsthand experience with. I've told this story before about how I went and picked up a girl in Wisconsin that I was dating this back in the early 90s. She was getting out of school. She just graduated, and I was going to drive her back, and we were going to have a nice little road trip. Worst road trip ever. I think it was around Utah, I decided I was going to give her my car and fly home. But anyway, on the way back, her mom wanted us to stop by some property that the family owned in Nevada. We finally find this property, and it's down like a desert road, about 4 miles, like nothing but dirt. We come into this area where it's got some homes and, old beat up trailers. We go to the end of the road. We figure out where her property is. There's an outhouse on that property. I'm like, oh my God, there's an outhouse on your property. She said, I don't think that's supposed to be there. This thing looked like it'd been there since the 1800s. As we get out of the car, the outhouse door opens up, and there's an old man coming out in long underwear. Looked like an old prospector, gray beard. He looks at us and goes, oh, you might want to get upwind of that. He walked into the trailer and disappeared. She's all, we're leaving. I was like, good plan. Now, Nevada has some strange rules. 15 years is the basic, but there are some other situations where it has to be 20 years. I find this strange because Nevada doesn't have a lot of privately owned property. It's like 75% of this state is owned by the government, or at least controlled by the government. If you were to eliminate all the land in Nevada that is owned or controlled by the United States government and then turn the rest into Nevada, Nevada would be the smallest state, like smaller than Rhode Island. But if you want to take over someone's piece of land in Nevada, it could take you 15, maybe 20 years. Might be able to get a ghost town out of that. Number 8, Arizona. Arizona has had a squatter issue for decades and decades. A lot of people have bought desert property over the years and never done anything with it. And then they show up there many years later and find out someone has turned it into a nice plot of land. There's an old story about a guy back in the 1970s, late 1970s, had just happened upon some land, parked his van there for a while, was just camping out. 1 week turned into 1 month, 1 month turned into 12 months, 12 months turned into 14 years. Eventually, the landowner had come by and asked him how long he'd been there and told him 14 years, and he'd turned it into something nice. I guess the owner asked the guy if he wanted to buy the land. He's all, I don't have any money. He's all, what do you got on you? He's all, $20. And the landowner said, close enough. Gave him the $20, gave him the acre of land. That's a nice squatter story. They're normally not like that. Most of the time in Arizona, there's either violence or a lot of court appearances, or both. I mean, if you look at most of Arizona, you just assume nobody owns a patch of land. Now, Arizona's a little weird. In Arizona, a squatter must occupy your property between 5 and 13 years. What's more, they must occupy your property in a specific way for them to have squatter rights, meaning they had to do something to the property. They had to actually set up something as a living space. Whether that's a motorhome, pitch a tent, build a cabin, something. It's normally 13 years, but there are some instances where it could be as low as 5. And I think that's just because they'd like people to take over the land. They'd like people to do something with the land in Arizona. Number 7, Alaska. Alaska, like Arizona, there's a lot of open land that nobody's doing anything with. Now, they do have a lot of national parks, national forests, state parks, things like that going on in Alaska. And they also have a lot of indigenous people that have lands there. And no, they're not all called Eskimos. That's just one tribe, I guess you could say, of people in Alaska. You would not believe how many people don't understand that. They think anyone that's an Inuit or a native Alaskan is called an Eskimo. They're not. In Alaska, squatters can invoke Alaska's squatter rights and claim possession if they have lived on the property for 7 years with color of title, or 10 years because of good faith, but mistaken belief that the property was within the boundaries of the adjacent real property that a squatter owned. Meaning, this is another situation where if you were building on somebody else's land that maybe was next to yours and you didn't realize it was theirs. Now, there are some court cases and some laws that may be passed, and I probably should have said this about Arizona because they're in the same situation, that may change all of this. I think there's a movement in government and people that own land of trying to get rid of squatters. It's become too much of a thing, like I said earlier. It can be anywhere between 7 and 10 years to claim squatter rights in Alaska. Number 6, South Carolina. South Carolina is the hospitality state, and they extend that hospitality to squatters. Not as much as other states, but they don't make a big deal out of it. In South Carolina, squatters can claim adverse possession of a property after living there for 10 years and meeting other requirements. These requirements include the property has been cultivated and improved, meaning if you started planting crops there, it's your property. Got to be there 10 years, of course, though. Squatters have added substantial enclosure to the land or building. Did they build a house? Did they build a log cabin? Did they build a tree house? The unit or area of land has been used for personal purposes, meaning you can't start a business there. Open and notorious use of the property as if they were the true owner. We get back to that thing. Did the neighbors think you lived there? And you had to have paid property tax. That's the funny thing about states. They usually don't care who's paying the property tax as long as someone's paying them. But South Carolina, 10 years, you could claim squatter rights and own a piece of property. Number 5, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a strange one because there's some situations where it can be 10 years, other situations where it can be 21 years. Now, if you look up the squatter rights in Pennsylvania, you'll find all kinds of things like holdover tenants, Homestead Act, and Pennsylvania squatter rights. Now, squatters are not always homeless, and Pennsylvania is a perfect example of that. This is very much a farming type of state, and a lot of people will start using land that nobody happens to be using. These are upstanding citizens of the community. You know, they got jobs, they make a living, but they start using some land that they know is abandoned, and eventually they just put in the paperwork and claim it as their own. But this is how you get it in Pennsylvania. The squatter must have paid municipal, county, and state taxes due on the land throughout the 10 to 21 years, which they have been in continuous possession of the land. The time frame is lengthier than most states, requiring squatters in Pennsylvania to be more persistent. But yeah, Pennsylvania, it's either 10 to 21 years. Number 4, New York. Now, this was a bigger deal in New York back in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. A lot of people were claiming abandoned properties around New York City. As New York City started gaining popularity again, that became less of a thing because every square inch of that city is a potential $1 million apartment. Abandoned loft apartments were a big thing, and usually in warehouse districts. And then, of course, you go upstate and you start finding small rural towns where people were actually taking over old homes. There's a saying in New York about this, and the saying is, keep your building busy or somebody else will. Now, New York State and New York City has some pretty strange rules. In New York, squatters have the rights after 30 days. It's written in the law that squatters have to be taken to court, making it difficult for the police to have the authority to remove them. Now, you can find rules like this in a lot of other places, but it's really a big deal in New York City. New York has a history of passing some of the toughest laws in the country that are meant to protect honest tenants from greedy landlords. But some lawmakers say that the laws have gone too far, and they are allowing dishonest tenants to take advantage of free housing for years at a time. Squatters. On March 20th of this year, which was a week ago Wednesday, a bill was filed to prevent squatters from having rights in New York. They kind of want to bring it to an end, and I think they're going to be the ones that actually do bring it to an end first. In New York, it could be as low as 10 years for you to gain full custody or ownership of a piece of property under squatter rights. Number 3, Texas. Texas, you got to have a whole decade. Yep, just like New York, a whole decade and you could have some property. Real estate professionals in Texas always remind people that if they have land, they need to check their acreage or someone else might claim it. This is a known thing and it's been happening for decades in Texas. Actually, it's been happening since the 1800s. Texas is another state that is starting to make moves to change squatter rights. I think if New York City doesn't make some drastic changes first, I'm pretty sure Texas will be the one that makes the biggest change the soonest. It takes 10 years to take property under squatter rights in Texas. Number 2, Florida. Yeah, I'm kind of surprised on this one. You know, when you think of Florida, you think of places like Tampa, Miami, Orlando, Fort Lauderdale. You rarely think of the inner parts of Florida where squatters and mullets roam freely. And in Florida, they have a lot of both, mullets and squatters. There's a story about a family that was all over Facebook telling everyone that they were going on this world tour and they were going to be gone for like 90 days. And it was just this great tour they were going to take and they were going to see the world. They came back, someone had been living in their house for about 90 days. It took them almost 2 years to get those people out of their house. If you want to claim squatter rights in Florida, it can take anywhere from 7 to 12 years. You have to maintain the property, you have to be there, you have to be known as the owner of the locals, like the neighbors or whatever, and you couldn't have taken it by force, meaning you had to creep in there when no one was home. So it can take 7 to 12 years to claim squatter rights in Florida. All right, before we get to number 1, if you're thinking about moving to a place and actually buying property, not claiming squatter rights, there's a link for Home and Money in the description area below. They can get you in touch with a real estate agent anywhere in the country. All right, on to number 1. And number 1, the Golden State, California. Yep, the Golden State has always had some funky laws, and they've always been kind of liberal with their laws. And when it comes to squatting, their laws almost make it a big welcome sign for people to come in and squat. In California, you only need 5 years to be on someone's property before you can start filing paperwork to make it your own. There was a Middle Eastern man, he was a millionaire or whatever, and he had owned a property in this place called Calabasas. If you don't know where that is, it's near Malibu. It's actually east of Malibu, and it's where the Kardashians lived for a long time. But he went back to the Middle East for like 2 years, came back to his place. There was a new family there. This was like a $5 million home, and there's just some people living there. Even celebrities squat in California. Remember Randy Quaid, Cousin Eddie from the Vacation movies? He was caught squatting in California twice. One of them was his old house. He just decided to move back in after he'd sold it a few years prior. I think he'd also got in trouble for doing it in Vermont too. But in California, even the celebrities are squatting, I guess. In California, a squatter can claim rights through adverse possession claim. They must occupy the property continuously for at least 5 years. Additionally, they must pay the property tax for that duration. And that's how they get it. Paying the property tax, California thinks it's yours. All right, that's today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you got some information out of it. Now go out, have a great day. Be nice to each other.